thank you so much for that very, very warm, generous introduction. And may I say thank you also on behalf of all Hortonistas, present and not present, for your tremendous dedication to this institution, I would say. I think after 40 years it qualifies for the term institution. We're all immensely proud of you, and we are so, so pleased and happy to be a part of it. So, ladies and gentlemen, so the Horton Seminar is back in town, finally back on its summer schedule, which is very important, and celebrating 40 glorious years. I'm looking forward to talking about diplomatic gifts in gold. And just to set out my stall, the way I thought I'd approach it is by posing and trying to answer 3 questions. Who, what, and why? Who was involved in the business of diplomatic gifts? What exactly were they? And why was gold so often considered the most appropriate material? But before I do that, since I'm first up, I thought it might be helpful to start by thinking a little bit about the nature of diplomatic gifts in general, their very varied meanings and their purposes over the centuries, millennia even. Diplomacy has been defined as the conduct of business between representatives of different states or international organizations. And in the days before rapid communications, ambassadors played a crucial role in statecraft. Of course, they would be briefed before they set out, and their instructions might subsequently be changed. But ultimately, they had to respond to the situation as they found it. And treaties, wars, and dynastic marriages stood or fell very often by their efforts. For this reason, they tended to be received with almost as much ceremony and lavishness as if they had been their prince themselves. A key part of diplomacy was the exchange of gifts. And these can be traced back as far as diplomacy itself. And one of the earliest references of all is as long ago as the 14th century BC, a touch before the Medici, when Akhenaten, pharaoh of Egypt, and Tushratta, king of Mitanni, exchanged gifts. Never mind for the moment what they were, we'll be returning to this later. The conventions governing such gifts were complicated. There were protocols about reciprocity and appropriateness, and these depended on the level at which they were given and what sort of message they were intended to send. So I'd like to kick off by looking at how some of these conventions worked. Basically, it depended on who you were relative to each other and what was at stake. For example, gifts weren't only exchanged between rulers. They were exchanged at lower levels too, and between unequal parties as well as equal. And they were given for many different reasons too. Between princes of equal status, they could be a mark of friendship. When from a lesser prince to a greater, a token of homage. And when from a greater to a lesser, a gesture of condescension. I said because I am given to saying condensation when I mean condescension. When given by a prince to an envoy, they were more like a reward, and they took many, many different forms. The what and the why were, of course, largely inseparable, but to keep things simple, let's pretend that they weren't. And we'll start with the why, the purposes for which diplomatic gifts were given. Essentially, they were intended to ease the transaction of business or to strengthen the relationship between the parties. They might very well be expected or even be all but essential, but the important thing to keep in mind is that they were understood to be freely given. Between princes on good terms, the generosity of their gifts might underline the warmth of their friendship. In such cases, they'd be carefully choreographed to be reciprocal and equal. Equal in type, equal in impressiveness, and equal in value. The gifts exchanged between Henry VIII and Francis I, when they met in person at the Field of Cloth of Gold, for example, were of that sort, even to the point of being virtually indistinguishable. And when they were made spontaneously, as happened once when Francis called on Henry unexpectedly one morning, it could lead to all sorts of difficulties. Henry thought he should mark the occasion by giving Francis a valuable jewelled collar that he happened to have to hand. This left Francis on the back foot and having to give the jewelled bracelets that he was wearing in exchange. And he worried then that they weren't of equivalent value, and later sent Henry a couple of fine horses to balance the books. But business wasn't always conducted between princes of equal standing, and when a ruler wanted to secure some benefit from his more powerful neighbour, it was often necessary for him to be disproportionately generous to conclude the deal. A good example of this was the Ottoman sultans, who invariably saw themselves as the more important state in any transaction. And while the sultans might receive hugely valuable gifts by way of tribute, what they gave in return tended to be more tokenistic, things like insignia and robes of honor, like this one on the right, that, working right up to the last minute, I happened to photograph in the National Museum in Bucharest on Saturday. These gifts from the sultans, they could be sumptuous and costly, but that wasn't the point. They were given and received as generous acts of patronage. Robes of honor were a special mark of favor, and they bound the recipient into a relationship, rather like the wearing of livery in Western Europe. And for that reason, such a gift could only be given in one direction. But this only worked when both sides recognized the imbalance. Where they didn't, or when one side deliberately chose to ignore it, you had the makings of an explosive situation. In the eyes of the 15th century Mamluk sultans of Egypt, the Timurid Empire was a Johnny-come-lately state, not at all their equal, and when its ruler sent Sultan Barzbey a robe of honor, it was perceived and presumably meant as a deliberate insult. A more famous gift of insult, if not actually real, was the scene in Henry V, when the ambassador of France gives the youthful Henry, newly installed on the throne, a present of tennis balls, with the advice that he should stick to tennis rather than war, which was man's stuff. It was throwing down the gauntlet, and you'll remember Henry's reply. If you can't, I am going to remind you of it. We are glad the Dauphin is so pleasant with us, and tell the pleasant prince, this mock of his hath turned his balls to gunstones. Shall this his mock mothers from their sons, mock castles down? And tell the Dauphin, his jest will save a butt of shallow wit, when thousands weep more than did laugh at it. Well, diplomacy and diplomatic presence, like the tennis balls, were not always about specific transactions. Sometimes they were simply about establishing a relationship, or reinforcing an existing one, or showing who was who. Turning to less provocative diplomacy, when the King of Siam sent his famous embassy to Louis XIV in 1686, it was in the hope of gaining favoured status as a trading partner. It was a huge investment in travel and gifts. Here are just some of them. And as it turned out, it wasn't a success. More successful in terms of generating goodwill was Manuel I of Portugal's gift of an elephant to Pope Leo X in 1514. The wretched animal was shipped from India to Portugal and then on to Rome. It was supposedly the first elephant to have been seen in Rome since antiquity. Getting it there was a monumental task, but it caused a sensation. And this is the very beast, as drawn by Giulio Romano. Goodwill gifts of this sort took many forms. Fine animals, not always as fine as elephants, were a favoured gift, especially magnificent horses and hounds, as were impressive arms and armour. A regular papal gift to Christian rulers was a sword and cap of maintenance. And in 1514, the same year as the elephant, the Emperor Maximilian gave Henry VIII this distinctly wacky, if technically astounding, helmet. In modern times, a great and significant gesture of goodwill was the Sword of Stalingrad. Do you all know about the Sword of Stalingrad? This was Winston Churchill's brilliant and inspired idea of a gift from George VI to Joseph Stalin and the Russian people. It was made in 1943 and sent on a whistle-stop tour of some 40 towns and cities in the UK before being flown out to Tehran for the Prime Minister's summit meeting with Stalin. It's inscribed on the blade, "To the steel-hearted citizens of Stalingrad, the gift of King George VI, in token of the homage of the British people." And one can imagine who drafted that text. And its purpose, like the sword itself, was double-edged. It was to raise public morale at home and to shore up the alliance at our darkest hour. And it did both. Sometimes diplomatic gifts were more about acknowledging some past benefit than ensuring a future one. One such that comes to mind is the collection of pictures adorning the walls of Apsley House, which were a gift, or some of them were a gift from the King of Spain to the Duke of Wellington in thanks for his role in the Peninsular War. But another, of course, is Nelson's famous Chelenk, given to him by Sultan Selim III after the Battle of the Nile in 1798. We'll be looking at other gifts of this nature later on. Some of the protocols of gifts demanded reciprocity, while others didn't. This can be confusing, and I thought it might be helpful to present it graphically. This chart, well, it's not supposed to be funny, but this chart gives a simplified picture, probably overly so, of normal conventions. Gifts between equal princes, like Henry VIII and Francis I, Prince A and Prince B at the top, were always reciprocal and normally equal, whereas those between unequal rulers were also reciprocal, but usually with the onus being on the vassal ruler to cough up more generously. Then there were the ambassadors at the heads of great embassies. These were in the best situation of all, because they would normally receive generous gifts at the end of their mission, but were not by and large expected to reciprocate. Certainly, at the bottom of the heap were the resident ambassadors, who might have been diligently representing the interests of their royal master for years, but who normally received no gift at all until the end of their term, when they would get a standardized and not especially valuable present. The next slide is a simplistic representation of the relative quantum of gifts, with those exchanged between princes or given to the great noble heading a diplomatic mission amounting to eye-watering sums, much greater than those given to a departing resident envoy. And it was a crucial ingredient of the system that the lavish gifts exchanged between princes were exactly that, exchanged. And this, you might say, made the whole system possible, because riches out balanced riches in. You might say this was a wonderfully smoke and mirrors system, in that a great sense of magnificence and extravagance could be conveyed at what was, in a sense, zero cost. So much then for the system. But what about the gifts themselves? I've crudely represented them by money bags, but in practice, they were, of course, much more varied than that. We've had a hint of that already with the elephant and the robes and the helmet. But broadly, they fell into three main categories: commodities, which included money; prestigious domestic products, things available in the giver's country but less obtainable and more desirable in the recipients; and marvels. Well, money doesn't call for much comment, but prestigious domestic products have always been a major category of diplomatic gifts. Among the latter, we're going to hear quite a lot, I imagine, during this conference about porcelain. When it first appeared from China in the Middle Ages, it was deemed so strange and wonderful that it was immediately enriched with precious mounts. Even in 1514, funny how that date keeps reoccurring, the date of Bellini's Feast of the Gods, it was envisaged, by some at least, as the ware of choice for the gods. Later, the secrets of homegrown European wonders were sufficiently well guarded that beautiful porcelain became ideal diplomatic gifts from the court of Saxony and Versailles. And by the way, I didn't choose this mice and bird entirely at random. It was Kate Foster's gift to the Ashmolean. Kate was one of the greatest supporters of the Horton Fair, as you mentioned her already, Brian, and we all miss her hugely. But other states had special products or resources too. Glass from Venice, ruby red glass from Bohemia, or silk from Byzantium. All of these were used for diplomatic gifts because they were prestigious and they were sought after elsewhere. Then we come to marvels. The sultans of the Mamluk dynasty held that the ability to excite wonder was an important quality of diplomatic gifts, and this they called tuhaf, T-U-H-A-F, tuhaf. It was a quality that could be manifested in a variety of ways through superlative craftsmanship, exotic and beautiful materials, or groundbreaking technology. And of course, more than one of these boxes could be ticked by a single piece, like this sumptuous casket with engraved rock crystal panels by Valerio Bailey, given by Pope Clement VII to Francis I when he paid a state visit, as it were, in 1532. Arguably, the most spectacular diplomatic gift of all time, ticking more boxes than you could imagine, was the famous Amber Room in Russia until it disappeared during World War II, which was given by Frederick of Prussia to Peter the Great. But tuhaf was not restricted to the inanimate. It was spectacularly found in animals too, and in early modern times, kings were much given to gifts of fine horses and hounds. And we've seen the effect of Manuel I's elephant, and a year later, he tried to upstage the trick by giving an even stranger and more exotic beast the world's most famous rhinoceros. Its celebrity, of course, was largely down to Albrecht Dürer's famously anatomically incorrect engraving. It wasn't poor Albrecht's fault. He never saw the animal himself and based his image on somebody else's sketch. But sad to say, the poor beast never made it to Rome. The ship on which he was being transported sank in the Mediterranean, and the poor beast drowned. But such gifts, I need hardly remind you, were not always what one might wish for in an ideal world, not least because they had to be kept and fed. As recently as 2016, President François Hollande of France, when visiting Mali, was generously presented with a baby camel. What could be nicer than that? Only there wasn't room on the presidential plane to take it home, so it was billeted on a local family until suitable arrangements could be made to ship it. Unfortunately, for reasons that are not entirely clear, perhaps something to do with translation, when the consular officials came to collect it, they found that the foster family had grown so fond of it that they'd eaten it. And so, finally, it's true. Having set the scene, we come to gold. We will in a moment when people have calmed down. As we've seen, one of the qualifying properties of diplomatic gifts was that they be desirable, and there has never been a time when gold has not ticked that box. In the case of ancient Egypt, it ticked a further box in that the pharaohs had the advantage of having it in abundance, whereas their neighbors didn't. And one of the earliest references to diplomatic gifts, I alluded to it earlier, is the one supposedly given by Pharaoh Akhenaten to Tushratta, king of Mitanni, in the 14th century BC. It comprised 2 wooden statues overlaid with gold. And no, I don't have a picture of it. But let's start not with an obscure gift from a pharaoh, but with the most famous of gifts of all time, those presented to the Magi, by the Magi to the infant Christ. Their embassy may be legendary, but it has all the necessary ingredients. The donors were wise men, kings even, who have traveled from a distant country. They've come to pay homage to a yet greater king, and the substance of their gifts, at least in part, is gold. You can see it all in Dürer's famous altarpiece in Florence. And of course, that's not all, for symbolism as well as material value is attached to their gifts. The gold vessels were containers as well as being things in their own right. And as you can see from this late 15th century illumination in the British Library, one of the golden vessels contained yet more gold. Gold, as such, symbolizes kingship, while the other gifts, frankincense and myrrh, allude to the Christ child's divinity and to his death, prefiguring the crucifixion. Of course, the biblical account, only in St. Matthew's Gospel, tells us what the gifts were, not what they looked like. And the form of their containers was down to artistic interpretation, and this was influenced by contemporary custom as much as design. So Dürer's cup takes the form of a German Willkommenpokal, or welcome cup, used by a guild to honor a distinguished guest. While the cup in the illumination reflects the Northern European custom of a ceremonial entry, whereby a prince arriving at a town for the first time might be honored and enriched by the present of a gold cup filled with gold coins. But why did gold continue to be a favored material when so many other desirable alternatives existed? Undoubtedly, its regal connotations played a part. As a gift to a king, especially when it was from a king, gold had a particular resonance, and the gifts exchanged between Richard II and Charles VI of France, when they met in person in 1396, for example, were mostly of gold. Things like this wonderful, slightly later enamel cup in the British Museum. This entered the English royal collection in the mid-15th century, and there it remained until being presented by James I to the Spanish ambassador, Juan Fernández de Velasco, after the Somerset House Conference in 1604, which restored peace between England and Spain. The cup was just part of the gift presented to the ambassador, all of gold. Nothing less would have been sufficient to underline the significance of the treaty, and I hope you'll forgive me for this flippant slide. But gold wasn't only regal. It was also convenient, due to its being valuable and recyclable. It was of known value, so you, the recipient, could know immediately what it, and by the way you, were worth. The same was true of silver, of course, but gold, ounce for ounce, was much more valuable than silver. So the equivalent of, say, this substantial gold cup, and I'm sorry about the fuzzy detail, but the sharper one didn't arrive from Christie's in time. This substantial gold cup, presented by Edward Lee to one of his trustees in 1765, would have been the equivalent in value of, shall we say, a small silver dinner service. Coupled with that was the fact that precious metal was recyclable and tradable, and always had been. Late in the reign of Henry VIII, the English ambassador to France, Henry Wotton, wrote that he had sold the plate given to him by Francis I almost immediately after getting it. He judged that it was all second-hand, and indeed recognized 2 of the cups as ones that he had been given on a previous occasion and had sold straight away afterwards then. And I quote, because it's rather a charming little passage, he says, "Since I had them as cheap first as now, I will sell them again, trusting that they love me so well that they will not be long away." These factors played to diplomatic gifts, where value and quantifiable value was crucial, regardless of where you figured in the hierarchy. The head of a great embassy in the 16th century would expect a hugely valuable gift, sometimes costing as much as £1,500, whereas a resident ambassador, after several years, would, on his departure, get a gold chain worth around £80 or £100 at the moment, at the maximum, perhaps something like this one in the British Museum. And pity the poor Venetian ambassador, because he would probably be fortunate indeed if he ever got to benefit from his relatively modest gift. Compared with other countries, Venice had a strict anti-corruption code, and all such presents had to be reported to the Senate, who would vote on whether the ambassador would be allowed to keep it, and normally he wasn't. Indeed, this extended right to the top, and the gift of a diamond ring from Henri III of France to the Doge created a tricky situation, since the gift could not be declined without causing offence. But equally, there was no question of the Doge being allowed to keep it. The Senate debated what to do with it, and it was decided in the end to mount it in a gold lily, commemorating Henri's goodwill towards Venice, and to deposit it in the treasury of San Marco. I don't know what eventually happened to the golden lily. It doesn't appear still to be in the treasury now, and perhaps it was melted down at a later date. This was the fate of most gifts of gold, sooner or later, either because the recipient or their state turned them into cash. But if you didn't need to monetarize the gift, you could choose to turn it into some other form that suited you better. This is exactly what Horatio Walpole, son of Prime Minister Robert Walpole, did with the gold chain he received at the end of his term as British ambassador in The Hague in 1737. He had it made into an impressive cup and cover by David Willow, with his family crest on the top, and the history of its diplomatic origins preserved in the Royal Dutch arms and the engraved chains. You see the chains looping around the top, engraved around the body. Well, by the late 18th century, the chain had largely given way to the gold box as the standard currency of diplomatic gifts, especially in France. This evolved from the so-called boîte à portrait, which had been a much favoured gift by Louis XIV, who gave, for example, 2 boîtes à portrait to the Swedish mediateur in 1667. I don't know exactly what mediateur were, but they were clearly people operating on some sort of a diplomatic level, but possibly not fully accredited ambassadors. Anyway, these were not really boxes at all, but miniature portraits contained within a precious box or jeweled frame like this one in the Louvre. The morphing of this type of gift into an actual box was delayed in France by Louis XIV's sumptuary laws, which forbade the use of more than a single ounce of gold in the making of an object. But this was relaxed in 1721, and the first surviving snuff box, known to have been made as a diplomatic gift, is in the Louvre and was presented by Louis XV to the Dutch ambassador in 1726. But most such presents either no longer survive or are unidentifiable as diplomatic gifts as such, because the evidence isn't there anymore. Like Henry Wotton in the 16th century, the Sardinian ambassador, the Comte de Viry, was fortunate enough to be able to give the same box, to be given the same box no less than 3 times, between 1770 and 1777. And each time he sold it back to the goldsmith who had supplied it to the king. Charles Truman, in his catalogue of the Wallace collection boxes, refers to one box that seems to have been batted around by Louis XVI to at least 3 grateful recipients, one after the other, starting with the papal nuncio and ending in 1771 with Horace Walpole. Like chains, however, there was a limit, normally, to the number of gold boxes a man might want. As a result of his tireless work at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 15, Lord Castlereagh found himself awash with no less than 21 gold boxes given to him by the crowned heads of Europe. And like Walpole, he decided to consolidate them into a single object. In his case, not a cup, but an inkstand. which he commissioned from Rundle Bridge and Rundle 7 years later, and the origins of which he has preserved by inscribing the arms of each of the crowns that had presented him with one of the gold boxes that made up the inkstand. However, as we've already seen, diplomatic gifts were not only about ambassadors, and I'd like to move on now to talking about a few other contexts in which gifts, if not strictly diplomatic, were at least very like them. One of those, and a very important one, was dynastic marriages. Here's one. Louis XII of France and Mary Tudor, younger sister of Henry VIII. These were, of course, very little to do with connubial bliss, especially in this case, and all supposedly to do with setting a long-term strategic alliance between the two states. And as part of that, they involved the transfer of considerable assets from one crown to another. Now, you might argue that these were not actual gifts, since they were not freely given, but negotiated, but they were very like gifts in effect. A typical negotiation of this sort was that concerning the marriage of Prince Arthur, son of Henry VII, with Catherine of Aragon in 1494. The negotiations went on and on. They involved cash and jewels and plate of both silver and gold. Some of this was agreed to be the bride's personal property, but the rest was treated as a gift to, or a transfer of assets to her parents, from her parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, to the English crown. Needless to say, none of this survives. It seldom does. But occasionally, the inclusion of a great treasure in a dowry is the very reason for its survival. Let me take just 4 examples. The exquisitely beautiful crown on the left in the Schatzkammer in Munich is recorded in the inventory of Richard II's jewels and formed part of the dowry of his successor, Henry IV's daughter, Princess Blanche, when she married the Palatine-elect Ludwig III in 1402. The reliquary on the right, known as the Golden Horse Reliquary, is in Altötting in Bavaria. It was made in Paris in about 1400 and was a New Year's gift from the French Queen to her husband, Charles VI, in 1404. It came to Altötting 100 years later as part of a marriage settlement and has been there ever since. Now, had either of these objects remained in their countries of origin, England and France, they would almost certainly not have survived. Likewise, these 2 famous objects in the Kunstkammer in Vienna, both were made for Francis I of France for his own use. The Cellini salt cellar in 1543, and a gold cup and cover made in Antwerp by Joseph Vézelay about 10 years earlier. But both were subsequently given by Francis's grandson, Charles IX, to Archduke Ferdinand II of Tyrol, who acted as a proxy for Charles at his wedding to Elizabeth of Austria in 1570. And once again, we can be 99% certain that they would not have survived the melting pot had they remained in France. Their gift abroad was effectively their salvation. It's a curious point, and I don't make it with any particular force, but both of these objects were repurposed. That is to say, they weren't originally made as gifts at all and were a couple of generations old by the time they took on that role. By then, prestigious though they would have been regarded as old-fashioned. I wonder if I can draw from that the conclusion that the reason they were let go was precisely because they were old-fashioned, or in the case of the Cellini salt, in a certain taste that was not Charles's. And might we assume from that that they were on the way out anyway, and would have been destined for the melting pot, if not for the diplomatic bag? Hard though it is to think that anyone would have chosen to melt the Cellini salt cellar, 16th century princes took fashion and gold very seriously. Another special category of quasi-diplomatic gifts is Papal Roses. These are unlike any other. The Pope was a ruler, and a very important one too. But the uniqueness of these gifts stem from the nature of the papacy itself, which, despite its secular aspects, was essentially a spiritual authority. And that helped determine the character of its gifts. These were always the same: a sword and cap of maintenance, as we've seen, and a golden rose. Compared with other diplomatic gifts, they were of trivial value, and as Leo X said, they were more to be esteemed for their spiritual value than for their matter. They were given each year, but just one, to some chosen Christian prince or prince of the church, and they were regarded as a mark of very special honour. The custom dated from as far back as the 11th century, and they didn't change except in the style of their vase. These span some 400 or 500 years. The one on the left was given to a king of France or Duke of Burgundy, it's not sure which, in the 15th century. The next one along in the middle was given to the Cardinal of Brandenburg in about 1520, and the one on the right to the Austro-Hungarian Emperor in 1819. More impressive than the rose itself, however, was the manner of its delivery. And this print shows, I'm sorry, it's not absolutely sharp, it's the best I could do. This shows the ceremonial of 1759, when the recipient of the rose was the Doge of Venice. In its upper frame, we see the rose being carried in a solemn procession to the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome, where the Pope on horseback under a canopy it can be seen in the foreground of the upper panel. In the left panel below, the rose is set on the altar and is being blessed by the Pope. And in the final panel, it's presented, again with much ceremony, to the Doge having arrived in Venice. Well, for my last few examples of diplomatic or perhaps quasi-diplomatic gifts, I want to mop up with a rather disparate group of objects. Gifts up, things given by loyal subjects to their prince or overlord. Gifts down, things graciously given by sovereigns to individuals for one reason or another. And things given to the great and the good by cities or public bodies. First then, gifts up. This cup, perhaps made in Augsburg and richly enamelled, was given to Count Nikolaus Rosenberg by the Emperor Leopold I in 1665 to commemorate the signing of a peace treaty with the Ottomans at Vasvar the previous year. The Latin inscription translates "long life and prosperity" to the Emperor Leopold, and it incorporates an apparently random smattering of larger capital letters. Can you see that what we can see? It runs all the way around the piece, but you see that there's a larger L, a larger D, a larger I, and M. Now, these are in fact a series of Roman numerals adding up to the date. Now, this is a method of cryptically showing a date that one sees again and again. And so it must have a name, and if anybody knows the name of that manner of expressing a date, I would be very, very grateful to hear it. Perhaps in the question session or privately afterwards, I'm sure one of you will know. Anyway, the cup has got the imperial arms, it's got the arms of Rosenberg, and on the side I'm not showing, it's got a bust of the emperor himself. It is, in other words, a highly personal and customized gift of homage to the emperor. As well it might be, for the Rosenberg family had extensive estates that stood to be lost completely but for the treaty. Rosenberg had much to be grateful about. If the Rosenberg cup is a personal homage, the covered beaker, perhaps also made in Augsburg, also as was the Rosenberg in the Gilbert collection in the V&A, also perhaps made in Augsburg, and dating from nearly a century later, is more of a collective homage. Its provenance has never been verified, but the most likely interpretation is that it was a gift from to Count Ludwig Friedrich I of Schwarzburg-Rudolstadt, represented by the electoral crown or coronet on the top, from the local nobility of Thuringia, all of whose arms are engraved around the body. Why? Well, because Ludwig Friedrich had evidently been prevented by the Elector of Saxony from taking his seat at the Reichstag in Regensburg until 1754, an eventual victory that was celebrated by the nobility with this gift. Certainly a gift up, and certainly diplomatic, though perhaps not in quite the usual sense, is a beaker, or rather two beakers, bought by the Levant Company for presentation to the wives of the British ambassadors to the Sublime Porte, or as we would say, Turkey. The earlier of the two, on the right, was made by George Garthorne and is hallmarked for 1685, and it was given to Lady Trumbull, whose husband was appointed ambassador in 1687, and the gift was made at Greenwich before Trumbull left to take up his post. Although no earlier ones survive, it seems that this was an established custom in the Levant Company, a fact that Lady Trumbull was well aware of, even if it seemed to have escaped the company's corporate memory. An entry in the company's minute book for March 1697 states that intimation had been given that the Lord Ambassador's lady was in expectation of a present, as her ladyship had understood other ambassadors' ladies had had. Well, the wheels were duly set in motion, and the cup was procured at a cost of about £60. One might assume that such a piece would have been specially commissioned, but interestingly, it must either have been in the goldsmith's stock or have been sourced second-hand, possibly from the wife of the retiring ambassador, who knows. He was already 2 years old at the time of the gift. The Trumbull Beaker, as I say, the one on the right, is small. It stands just 10 centimetres high, and it's quite plain, other than being engraved with the recipient's arms. The other beaker, by John Boddington in 1697, was intended as the gift to Sir James Rushout, only it wasn't presented because he died before taking up his post. It's of exactly the same form, but larger, heavier, and a touch grander, having a cover, and it's rather more impressively engraved, this time not with Rushout's arms, but with those of the company. Well, we don't know exactly what gave rise to this tradition, but one doesn't need to look far for a reason. It was a gift to generate goodwill, and perhaps a sense of obligation too. The Levant Company had its work cut out, working its way into the Middle Eastern markets. To have the support of the British ambassador can't have been a bad thing, both in Turkey and at home. From gifts up to gifts down, and two diamond-set snuff boxes in the Gilbert collection, both Russian, but one with a different twist. The one on the left has an interesting history in that it was presented by Catherine the Great or her son to an Englishman, Nathaniel Dimmesdale, in 1768. Dimmesdale was a doctor and a pioneer in the field of inoculation. In that year, a smallpox epidemic was raging in Russia, and Dimmesdale was invited to St. Petersburg to inoculate the Empress and her son. The treatment, rather bravely submitted to, you might say, by Catherine, was deemed a success, and Dimmesdale was handsomely rewarded. In addition to this and another box, he received a lump sum of £10,000 plus £2,000 of travel expenses and an annuity of £500. Now, the box bears no internal evidence of the presentation, but it remained in the family until the 1980s and was probably just one box among many that Catherine happened to have to hand at the time. The one on the right is a surrogate for another, discussed by Charles Truman, and which was almost identical to it. The other one was a gift from that same Sultan Selim III of Turkey to Admiral Lord Keith in 1808 in recognition of Keith's support of the Turkish fleet against the French. It was, in other words, exactly equivalent to Nelson's Schellenk. It would be a shame to move on without mentioning just one more Gilbert box, this gold-mounted amethyst specimen of about 1755. It's all royal, or rather imperial. On the cover is the cipher of Catherine's predecessor, Elizabeth Petrovna. On the front, the insignia of the Order of St. Andrew, and inside, a miniature portrait of the Tsarina herself. But if it was made as a diplomatic gift, it may never have been presented, since it still belonged to the imperial family until the Revolution. Either never presented, or it had followed that familiar churn of having been presented, sold down the road, and then reacquired for stock for future gifts. My final category of quasi-diplomatic gifts are just like the real thing, though without the international component. Gold boxes presented by British cities to distinguished individuals and containing a scroll conferring the freedom of the city. There are many of these, and I just show just three here. Two enamelled ones, which were both presented by the City of London to naval officers. Earl Howe in 1794, that's the one on the top left, and Sir Robert Calder, first captain of the fleet in 1797. And that one on the right, which is an absolutely astonishing piece, is, for reasons that nobody seems to know, in now the mayoral collection of plate at Portsmouth. The third, embossed with Rococo ornament, was given to one Robert Alsop, governor of the new plantations, by the city not of London but of Londonderry in 1765. There's nothing standard issue about these boxes. They're all quite different and carefully customized for the occasion, and clearly no expense was spared. Well, looking at my watch, I think it's time to wrap up. This has been a very speedy tour d'horizon of quite a big subject, diplomatic gifts in general. And then, of a smaller but still quite complicated one, gifts made specifically of gold. That fact is made more complicated by the fact that relatively few objects survive that we can be sure were made for that very purpose. Either they had been melted down or the circumstances of their original purpose has been lost. But those few that do survive, even if remodeled, as it were, and the group on the screen here will do as examples, are striking reminders of the importance of ambassadorial gifts and of the ambassadorial role at a time when historic and binding decisions had to be taken without any possibility of the ambassador referring back to his government for new instructions. The gifts mattered because the role mattered. Thank you.